Silver Creek, Colorado Territory, winter, 1884. Don't look, stranger, the first gunman growled, tightening his grip on his revolver. Turn your horse around, warned the second. The third stepped closer with a cruel grin. Unless you want to die beside her. Silas Thorne looked down at Eleanor, bleeding in the dust, while Judd pressed a pistol against her trembling face. Please, she whispered, her eyes fierce despite her fear. Don't let them take my father's land. Silas slowly climbed down from his horse. I am done looking away. 3 men warned him not to look, but when this lonely cowboy refused, he uncovered a secret that would destroy his own family. Stay with us, subscribe to the channel, and let the story begin. The sun beat down on Silver Creek like a hammer on a hot anvil. Dust coated everything. The boardwalks, the windows, the people. Silas Thorne tasted the grit in his teeth. He didn't care. He just wanted a bag of coffee and a box of .44 caliber shells. He kept his Stetson pulled low. That was his only rule these days. Keep your head down. Mind your own business. The world had enough trouble. He wasn't about to add to it. He guided his roan gelding toward the hitching post outside the general store. Then he heard the sound. It wasn't a gunshot. It was the heavy, sickening thud of a body hitting the packed dirt of the town square. Silas pulled back on the reins. The roan stopped. Silas didn't turn his head right away. He stared at the wooden post in front of him. Don't look, his brain told him. It's not your fight. But a woman cried out, not in fear. In sheer, unadulterated anger, Silas turned his head. 3 men stood in the center of the square. They were big, thick-necked men wearing dust-caked canvas coats. At their feet lay a young woman. Her skirt was torn at the hem. Her dark hair was loose, plastered to her cheek by a streak of fresh blood. The man in the middle stepped forward. He had a cruel face and expensive boots. He held a crumpled piece of paper in his fist. Sign the paper, Eleanor, the man said. His voice was smooth. Too smooth for a town this rough. Your daddy is in the ground. You have no money. The bank owns the deed now. Sign it, or my boys will break your writing hand, and I'll sign it for you. The woman, Eleanor, pushed herself up on her elbows. She spat a mixture of dirt and blood at the man's expensive boots. My father paid that note, she said, her voice shook. But it didn't break. You forged this. You're stealing my land. You're stealing from the Mexican families across the creek. I won't sign. I won't give you a damn thing. Judd. Silas felt a cold knot pull tight in his gut. He looked closer at the man holding the paper. He looked at the man's right hand. There, gleaming in the harsh afternoon sun, was a heavy gold signet ring. It bore the crest of a silver pine tree crossed with a pickaxe. The Thorne family crest. Silas hadn't seen that ring in 10 years. Not since he walked away from his bloodline. Not since he realized his family built their fortune on the broken backs of poor folks. Judd Thorne. His cousin, one of Judd's thugs, noticed Silas sitting on his horse. The thug rested a dirty hand on the butt of his revolver. He took a step toward Silas. Don't look, stranger, the thug growled. His voice carried across the quiet square. People on the boardwalks were already stepping back into the shadows, peeking through curtains. Doing nothing, turn away and keep your life. This ain't your business. Silas felt the old instinct kick in, the survival instinct, the one that told him to ride out. He had lost his wife to men just like this, men who used paper and bullets to take whatever they wanted. Fighting them only got you graves to dig. He grabbed the reins. He prepared to turn the horse. Then he looked at Eleanor. She wasn't crying. That was the thing that caught him. She was surrounded by violence. She was bleeding. She was entirely alone in a town full of cowards. But her eyes were dry. They burned with a fierce, quiet dignity. She was looking right at Silas. She didn't plead. She just watched him, waiting to see what kind of man he was. In that split second, the silence in the square felt deafening. Silas realized something fundamental. Apathy wasn't survival. Apathy was complicity. If you watch a wolf tear apart a lamb and do nothing, you aren't an innocent bystander. You're just a wolf who doesn't like the taste of blood. Silas let go of the reins. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the dirt. His boots hit the ground with a soft thud. The thug with his hand on his gun frowned. I told you to turn away, boy. Silas walked forward. His strides were slow, measured. His gray eyes were locked on Judd. I heard you, Silas said. His voice was low, carrying a rhythmic cadence that demanded attention. But a man who looks away when a woman is dragged through the dirt isn't a man at all. He's just a shadow taking up space. Judd finally looked up from Eleanor. He squinted at Silas. Recognition hadn't set in yet. Silas was covered in a month of trail dust and sporting a thick beard. Listen to my man Drifter, Judd sneered. This is a legal matter. This girl owes a debt. She doesn't owe you breath, Silas said. He stopped 10 feet away. You want land? Go work for it. You want respect. Stop putting your hands on people who can't fight back. Human dignity isn't something you can sign away on a piece of forged paper. Judd's face darkened. Kill him. The first thug cleared his leather holster. He was fast, Silas was faster. Silas didn't even draw his pistol. He stepped inside the man's guard in a blur of motion. He grabbed the thug's wrist, twisting it sharply. A sickening snap echoed in the square. The man screamed, dropping his gun. Silas drove an elbow into the man's jaw, sending him crashing into the water trough. The second thug lunged with a hunting knife. Silas stepped off the center line. He let the momentum carry the man past him. Silas brought his heavy boot down on the back of the man's knee, collapsing his leg. A quick, brutal strike to the back of the neck left the second man unconscious in the dust. It took less than 5 seconds. Judd stumbled backward, dropping the paper. His hand clawed at his own holster, but he froze. Silas had his Colt .45 drawn. The barrel was aimed dead center at Judd's chest. Draw it, Silas whispered. Give me a reason. Judd stared at the dark eye of the barrel. The color drained from his face. He slowly raised his empty hands. The gold signet ring caught the light one last time. Silas didn't shoot. He kept the gun leveled with his right hand and reached down with his left. He grabbed Eleanor by the arm, hauling her to her feet. She stumbled, but he caught her waist, keeping her steady. She was trembling, but her jaw was set tight. Can you ride? Silas asked her. His eyes never left Judd. Yes, she breathed. Get on my horse. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She ran to the roan and pulled herself into the saddle. Silas began to back up slowly. Step by step, you're a dead man, Judd yelled. His voice cracked with humiliation. You hear me. You don't know who you're messing with. I own this town, you own dirt, Silas replied. He reached the horse. He swung up behind Eleanor in one fluid motion. He spurred the roan hard. The horse reared, kicking up a cloud of thick, blinding dust into the faces of the men on the ground. Silas didn't look back. He rode out of the square, out of the shadows, and straight toward the towering peaks of the Whispering Pines. 3 men had warned him not to look. He had refused. And as the wind rushed past his ears and the warm weight of the woman leaned against his chest, Silas knew his quiet life was officially over. Everything had just changed. The ascent into the Whispering Pines was brutal. The trail was narrow. The air grew thin and sharp. Silas rode in silence. He kept the roan at a steady, grueling pace. The horse breath plumed in the freezing air. Behind him, Ellie held onto his waist. Her grip was tight, desperate. She didn't speak. She didn't complain. Silas appreciated that. He didn't have the energy for words. The adrenaline from the town square was fading. In its place, a cold, familiar ache settled deep in his side. It was an old bullet wound. A parting gift from a life he tried to leave behind. Usually, it just throbbed when the weather turned. It burned. The physical exertion of the fight had torn something loose. He felt a slow, warm trickle of blood against his ribs. He ignored it. He kept his eyes on the trail. The sky above them bruised to a deep, angry purple. The temperature plummeted. The Whispering Pines earned their name. The wind began to howl through the massive evergreens. It sounded like voices warning them to turn back. We need shelter, Silas said. His voice was rough. The wind nearly swallowed it. How far? Ellie asked. Her teeth chattered. 2 miles, my cabin. He spurred the horse. The first flakes of snow fell. They weren't soft or drifting. They were hard, driving pellets of ice. A mountain blizzard was moving in fast. Silas' vision blurred. The edges of the world turned gray. The burning in his side spread to his chest. His breathing grew shallow. He gripped the saddle horn to keep from swaying. Silas, Elias' voice sounded far away. Are you all right? You're shaking. Hold on, he muttered. The trees finally broke. A small, weathered log cabin sat nestled against a sheer rock face. It was rough, built for survival, not comfort. Silas pulled back on the reins. The roan stopped near the small covered porch. Silas swung his leg over. His boots hit the dirt. His legs buckled. The ground rushed up to meet him. He hit the freezing mud hard. The world spun into darkness. Ellie scrambled off the horse. She fell to her knees beside him. She grabbed his heavy canvas coat and pulled. Silas, wake up. You can't lay here. He didn't move. His skin was burning hot. A fever had taken hold with terrifying speed. Ellie looked around. The snow was falling thicker now. The wind screamed. They were miles from anywhere. She was a rancher's daughter. She knew how to ride. She knew how to manage books. She had never dragged a 200-pound man out of a blizzard. Panic fluttered in her chest. She clamped it down. Panic meant death. She grabbed him by the arms. She dug her boots into the mud. She pulled inch by inch. It was agonizing. Her muscles screamed. She dragged him onto the porch. She found the latch on the heavy oak door. It gave way. The inside of the cabin was freezing. Dark smelled of dust and old pine. She dragged him onto a low cot in the corner. She stripped off his wet coat. That was when she saw the blood. A dark stain spreading across the side of his flannel shirt. She ripped the fabric open. An old scar was inflamed and angry. Fresh blood seeped from a newly opened tear. Infection, the fever, was burning him alive. Ellie needed a fire. She needed hot water. She ran outside. The wind nearly knocked her over. She found the woodpile beneath a tarp. The logs were massive, unsplit. An axe was buried in a stump. Ellie grabbed the axe. The handle was rough and freezing. She swung it at a log. The blade bounced off. The shock traveled up her arms, vibrating in her teeth. She gritted her teeth. She swung again and again. Wood splintered. Her palms began to chafe. The skin blistered and tore. She ignored the pain. She swung with all the anger she held inside. Anger at Judd Thorne. Anger at the men in the square. Anger at her father for leaving her alone. She gathered the split wood. She carried it inside. She built a fire in the stone hearth. Her bleeding hands fumbled with the matches. Finally, a spark caught. The flames chewed the dry pine. Light pushed back the shadows. She found a cast-iron pot. She packed it with clean snow and set it over the fire. For the next 10 hours, Ellie fought a war. She boiled water. She tore strips from her own petticoat. She cleaned the infected wound on Silas's side. He thrashed in his delirium. He muttered names she didn't know. He called out for a woman. He cursed the men who took his land. Ellie held him down. She pressed cool, wet rags to his burning forehead. She kept the fire roaring. She chopped more wood. Her hands bled freely now. She wrapped them in dirty cloth and kept moving. She refused to let this man die. He didn't look away from her. She wasn't going to look away from him. Sometime near dawn, the wind died down. The cabin was sweltering. The fire popped quietly in the hearth. Ellie sat on the floor beside the cot. Her back rested against the rough logs of the wall. She was exhausted. Her eyes were heavy. She finally drifted to sleep. A raspy voice broke the silence. You build a good fire. Ellie's head snapped up. Silas was awake. His gray eyes were clear. The fever had broken. He looked tired, hollowed out, but he was alive. He shifted on the cot. He looked down at his side. He saw the clean bandages. He smelled the herbs she had found in a jar on his shelf. Then he looked at Ellie. He looked at her hands. The crude rags she had wrapped around her palms were soaked in dried blood. Her skin was raw and torn from the axe handle. Silas sat up. The movement caused him pain, but he hid it well. He swung his legs over the edge of the cot. He didn't say thank you. The words felt too small. He pointed to a small wooden box on the table. Bring that here. Ellie stood. Her legs were stiff. She brought the box to him. She sat on the edge of the wooden chair, facing the cot. Silas opened the box. Inside was a tin of soothing salve and clean white cotton rolls. He looked at her hands. Then he looked her in the eye. May I? He asked. His voice was low, gentle. Ellie hesitated. She was used to men taking what they wanted. Men grabbing her wrists, men forcing her hand. Silas didn't move. He kept his hands in his lap. He waited. He offered her the one thing no man in Silver Creek had offered her in weeks, a choice, Ellie whispered. She held out her trembling hands. Silas took them. His touch was incredibly light for a man who had broken two thugs with brutal force. His fingers were careful, precise. He unwrapped the dirty rags. He didn't flinch at the raw, bleeding blisters. He applied the salve. The cooling mint stung, then brought immediate relief. He wrapped her palms in the clean cotton. He tied the knots neatly. He didn't rush. You shouldn't have had to do that, Silas said quietly. You're a rancher's daughter, not a lumberjack. I did what I had to do, Ellie said. You saved my life in the square. I owed you a debt. Silas let go of her hands. He leaned back. You don't owe me anything, Silas said. A man shouldn't expect payment for doing what's right, and a woman's body isn't a ledger to be balanced. He looked away. He stared at the fire. We stay here until the storm clears, he said. Then we figure out how to get your land back. Ellie looked at her bandaged hands. The throbbing pain was gone. In its place was a strange, unfamiliar warmth. The walls of the cabin felt small, but for the first time since her father died, she felt entirely safe. The storm raged for 2 days. It buried the whispering pines in a suffocating blanket of white. Inside the cabin, time slowed down. Silas healed quickly. His fever didn't return. By the second afternoon, he was moving around the small room. He moved with a quiet, lethal grace, like a wolf pacing a cage. Ellie watched him. He was a hard man to read. He kept his emotions locked tight behind his gray eyes. He spoke only when necessary. They shared meager rations, dried venison, hardtack, bitter coffee boiled over the open flames. The silence between them wasn't hostile. It was heavy. It was the silence of two people carrying too much weight to make small talk. On the second evening, the wind outside finally died to a low moan. The fire crackled brightly. Ellie sat at the small wooden table. She was tracing the grain of the wood with a bandaged finger. Silas sat by the hearth. He was oiling the cylinder of his Colt .45. The rhythmic click of the metal was the only sound in the room. Her name was Sarah, Silas said suddenly. Ellie stopped tracing the wood. She looked up. Silas didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the gun. His hands moved mechanically. My wife, he clarified. His voice was flat, empty of emotion. That made it hurt worse to hear. We had a small plot of land down in the valley. Good soil. We built a cabin with our own hands. He snapped the cylinder back into the frame. The railroad wanted a clear path to the river. They didn't want to pay for it. They brought in a judge. They brought in men with badges and shotguns. They said our deed was invalid, wrote the laws to suit themselves. Silas set the gun down. He stared into the flames. We fought them in the courts. We starved while we waited for justice. Sarah caught sick, a fever, like the one I just had, only I couldn't buy medicine. The bank froze what little coin we had. I sat beside her bed and watched her take her last breath. We had nothing. They took it all. Legally, he picked up a rag. He wiped the excess oil from the barrel. After she died, I pinned on a badge. Became a federal marshal. Thought I could fix the broken system from the inside. I was wrong. The law is just a tool. In the hands of a good man, it builds. In the hands of a corrupt man, it crushes. He looked at Ellie. His eyes were dark. That's why I walked away. That's why I look at the ground. You fight the wind. You just end up exhausted and cold. The men who took your farm, they're the wind. You can't beat them, Eleanor. You can only run. Ellie listened. Her heart ached for the broken man sitting across from her. She understood his pain. She understood the crushing weight of systemic cruelty. But she refused to accept his conclusion. She stood up. She walked over to the hearth. She sat down on the rough wooden floor, directly across from him. She forced him to look at her. My father, Ellie said softly, was a quiet man. He owned our ranch. He kept to himself, at least. That's what the town thought. She leaned forward. He taught me how to read the ledger. He taught me how to ride, but he taught me something else. He told me that this land wasn't just for the people holding the biggest guns or the most money. He believed the frontier belonged to everyone who bled for it. Silas frowned. Belief doesn't stop bullets. No, Ellie agreed, but it stops cowards from sleeping at night. My father spent the last 3 years of his life working in secret. He helped the Mexican laborers across the creek translate their contracts. He helped the native families understand the treaties the mayor was forcing on them. He was building a case against Cornelius Thorne, a legal case, and they killed him for it. Silas went perfectly still. They didn't just want my farm, Silas. They wanted to silence him. They wanted to bury the truth. Ellie reached out. She didn't ask permission this time. She placed her bandaged hand over his ruff. Silas looked down at her hand. He didn't pull away. You loved Sarah, Ellie said. Her voice was fiercely gentle. You loved her enough to let her death break you. But grief isn't a cave you hide in. Silas, it proof you have a heart left to give. Silas swallowed hard. His jaw tightened. Honoring the dead doesn't mean dying slowly with them, Ellie continued. She squeezed his hand. It means living a life that makes their sacrifice mean something. It means standing up for the next Sarah, the next family. You didn't look away from me in the square. Don't look away now. Silas stared at her. The firelight danced in her dark eyes. She wasn't a victim. She was a survivor. She was a woman who had lost everything, yet still had the strength to carry the weight of others. What do you want to do? Silas asked. The apathy was gone from his voice, replaced by a low, dangerous focus. My father hid his ledger, Ellie said. A lockbox. He left it with an old friend, Gideon. At the settlement on the other side of the ridge. It has the proof, the forged deeds, the names, all of it. We take that ledger to the federal judge in the capital. We burn their corrupt empire to the ground. Silas looked at the gun resting on his knee. He looked back at Ellie. He turned his hand over. He laced his fingers through hers. It was a simple gesture, but in the quiet warmth of the cabin, it felt like a vow. Tomorrow, Silas said, when the snow clears, we ride for Gideon S. place. Ellie nodded. A tear finally escaped her eye. It tracked through the dirt on her cheek. Silas reached up. He brushed it away with his thumb. The storm raged outside, but the ice inside the cabin had finally broken. Morning broke like cracked glass, cold, sharp, clear. The blizzard had moved on, leaving the whispering pines buried under 2 feet of pristine snow. The world was blindingly bright. Silas saddled the roan. He moved a little stiffly, but his strength had returned. He checked his rifle. He checked his pistol. He packed their meager supplies into the saddlebags. Ellie emerged from the cabin. She wore her heavy wool coat, her breath plumed in the air. Her eyes were bright with purpose. Ready, Silas asked. Ready. He hoisted her into the saddle and swung up behind her. They began the slow, treacherous descent down the far side of the mountain. The settlement, where Gideon lived, was a small collection of shacks and lean-tos in the valley below. It was home to the Mexican laborers who worked the mines and a few displaced native families trying to scratch out a living on the unforgiving rock. It took them 4 hours to navigate the snow-choked trail. The silence of the mountains was absolute. But as they crested the final ridge overlooking the valley, the silence broke. Silas pulled hard on the reins. The roan snorted, tossing its head. What is it? Ellie asked. Silas didn't answer. He just pointed. A thick, oily column of black smoke rose from the valley floor. It stained the perfect blue sky. The wind shifted. The smell hit them. Burning pine, charred canvas, the unmistakable, sickening scent of scorched earth. No, Ellie whispered. Silas spurred the horse forward. They rode hard through the deep snow, pushing the roan to its limits. They broke through the tree line and stopped at the edge of a high bluff looking directly down into the settlement. It was gone. The shacks were reduced to glowing embers. The tents were ash. Small figures were scattered across the snowy valley floor. Families huddled together in the freezing cold, weeping, bleeding. In the center of the destruction sat a dozen men on horseback. They wore thick canvas coats. They carried rifles. At the head of the pack was a man Ellie recognized immediately, Mayor Cornelius Thorne. He sat on a massive black stallion. He looked down at the shivering families with an expression of mild annoyance, like a man looking at insects that had ruined his picnic. Judd Thorne sat beside his father, a cruel smile playing on his lips. They burned them out, Ellie gasped. Her voice trembled, not with fear. With a rage so profound, it stole the air from her lungs. In the middle of winter, they burned them out of their homes. She saw old Gideon, the man her father trusted. He was on his knees in the snow. One of the mayor's thugs stood over him, holding a rifle barrel to the back of his neck. The lockbox, Ellie said. They're looking for my father's ledger. She didn't think. She just reacted. Ellie threw her leg over the saddle. She intended to slide to the ground. She intended to run down that hill and tear Cornelius Thorne from his horse with her bare hands. Silas caught her. His arm locked around her waist like a band of iron. He hauled her backward, pinning her against his chest. "Let me go," Ellie screamed. She thrashed against his grip. "They're killing him." "Let me go." "Silas." "No," Silas hissed. His voice was right in her ear. Harsh, urgent. "Look down there, Eleanor. Look at the numbers. 12 men with rifles. High ground doesn't matter when you're outgunned 6-1. You run down there, you die. And Gideon dies anyway. I can't just watch." She sobbed. She slammed her fists against his arm. "I can't look away. You told me not to look away." "I didn't say look away," Silas said. He tightened his grip, holding her securely until she stopped thrashing. "I said don't throw your life away." Ellie slumped against him. She was panting, her tears hot tracks against the freezing wind. Below them, Cornelius Thorne raised his hand. The thug stepped back from Gideon. Gideon didn't move. He stayed on his knees in the snow. Cornelius yelled something. The words were lost to the wind, but the meaning was clear. "Leave." The mayor turned his horse. His men followed. They rode out of the ruined settlement, leaving the families to freeze in the ashes of their lives. Silas waited until the riders were a mile down the valley. Only then did he release his grip on Ellie. She slid off the horse. She didn't wait for him. She ran down the snowy slope, slipping and sliding, her boots tearing through the powder. Silas followed. When they reached the valley floor, the devastation was absolute. The heat from the glowing embers melted the snow, turning the ground to a slurry of mud and ash. A young Mexican woman sat in the dirt, rocking a crying infant. An old native man stood staring blankly at the charred remains of his wagon. They had lost everything because they were in the way. Ellie ran to Gideon. The old man was bruised, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. He looked up at her with tired, sorrowful Ellie, he croaked. "I'm here, Gideon, I'm here." She fell to her knees beside him. She took his cold, shaking hands. "Did they find it? Did they find the ledger?" Gideon coughed. He shook his head slowly. "No," the old man whispered. "I buried it under the floorboards of the old mill before they came. They burned my house, but they didn't find the truth." Ellie let out a ragged breath. She closed her eyes. Silas stood behind her. He surveyed the ruined settlement. He looked at the crying children. He looked at the defeated men. He had seen this before. He had lived this before. But this time, it felt different. This time, he wasn't standing over his dying wife in an empty cabin. He was standing next to a woman who had the power to tear the whole corrupt system down. Silas crouched down beside Ellie. "They didn't just want your farm," Silas said. His voice carried across the ash. He made sure the people nearby heard him. "They want the whole valley for the railroad. And they don't view anyone here as human beings. They view them as obstacles." Ellie opened her eyes. She looked at the faces of the people around her. They were looking at her. "Waiting, my father," Ellie said. Her voice grew stronger. It cut through the cold air. "My father believed that the law should protect everyone, not just the wealthy, not just the mayor, everyone." She stood up. She brushed the ash from her knees. "We are going to the mill," Ellie said to Silas. "We are digging up that ledger, and then we are riding to the capital." She turned to the surviving families. "Gather whatever you can salvage," Ellie told them. "Head up to the caves near Whispering Pines. The weather is breaking. You can survive there. Hide. Wait for us." Gideon looked up at her. "Ellie, Cornelius has the judges in his pocket. He has the law, then we will find a bigger law," she said fiercely. She looked at Silas. The cowboy was watching her with a profound, quiet respect. "Are you with me, Silas?" she asked. Silas stood up. He looked at the smoke drifting into the sky. He thought of his uncle. He thought of the blood in his own veins. He checked the action on his rifle. The sharp metallic clack echoed in the silent valley. "I'm with you," Silas said. "We go to the mill. We get the ledger. And then we make them pay for every drop of blood they spilled in the snow." They turned toward the ruins of the old mill. The real war had just begun. The dirt under the old mill was frozen solid. Silas used a broken iron crowbar to break the earth. Ellie dug with her bare, bandaged hands. They worked in frantic silence. The smell of the burning settlement still clung to their clothes. Finally, the crowbar struck something hollow, metal hitting metal. Silas cleared the loose dirt. He pulled a heavy iron lockbox from the earth. The brass lock was old but sturdy. He didn't bother looking for a key. He raised the crowbar and brought it down hard. The lock shattered. Ellie flipped the lid open. Inside sat a thick leather-bound ledger. Stacked beneath it were dozens of folded papers, deeds, contracts, letters bearing the official seal of the territorial capital. Ellie picked up the ledger. She ran a thumb over the worn leather. Her father's handwriting filled the margins. Precise, careful, a quiet man's war recorded in blue ink. We have it, she whispered. Then we move, Silas said. He checked the horizon. They left the valley, but they didn't go far. Mayor Thorne isn't a fool. He knows Gideon didn't burn alone. He knows someone is out here. They mounted the roan. Silas spurred the horse toward the heavy timberline. They needed the cover of the ancient pines. Open ground meant death. They rode hard for an hour. The snow grew deeper. The trees grew thicker. Then Silas heard it, the sharp snap of a dry branch, not the heavy, rhythmic crack of a deer. It was the careful, deliberate sound of a horse being urged forward by a rider trying to stay quiet. Silas pulled back on the reins. He held up a hand. Ellie froze behind him. She listened. A low whistle carried through the freezing air. It came from their left. Another whistle answered from their right. We're flanked, Silas muttered. He slid off the horse. He pulled his Winchester rifle from the saddle scabbard. Judd sent a posse back to sweep the perimeter. They tracked our hoofprints in the fresh snow. How many? Ellie asked. She slid down beside him. At least 6, spread out. Silas looked at the terrain. A jagged cluster of granite boulders sat 50 yards up the slope. Get behind those rocks. Take the horse. Do not show your head. Ellie didn't argue. She grabbed the reins and ran. Silas moved in the opposite direction. He slipped into the shadows of a massive pine. He let his breathing slow. He became part of the forest. The first rider appeared through the trees. He held a repeating rifle across his saddle. His eyes scanned the snow. He saw the tracks leading up toward the boulders. He raised a hand to signal the others. He never got the chance. Silas fired. The Winchester cracked like a whip. The shot didn't aim for flesh. It struck the icy branch directly above the rider. A massive cascade of heavy, wet snow dumped onto the man and his horse. The horse panicked. It reared up, throwing the rider into a snowbank. Gunfire erupted from the trees. Bullets chewed the bark around Silas. He ducked, moving fast. He didn't shoot blindly. He let them waste their lead. He let the echoes confuse them. He flanked them. He moved like a ghost through his own graveyard. He caught the second man, trying to circle around the boulders. Silas stepped out from behind a tree. He swung the stock of his rifle hard. It caught the man under the jaw. The man collapsed in a heap. 4 left. Silas heard boots crunching in the snow nearby. Someone was creeping through the brush, trying to get a clear angle on Elias' position. Silas dropped to a crouch. He moved silently through the thick snowdrifts. He rounded a cluster of frosted bushes. He found him. It wasn't a hardened thug. It was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 18. His hands were shaking so hard the rifle barrel rattled against a tree trunk. His face was pale. Terror lived in his wide, blue eyes. Silas stepped up behind him. He pressed the cold muzzle of his Colt .45 against the base of the boy's skull. "Drop it," Silas whispered. The boy gasped. The rifle slipped from his hands. It fell into the snow. "Turn around." Slow. The boy turned. Tears tracked through the grime on his cheeks. He looked at the gun in Silas's hand. Then he looked at Silas's face. He squeezed his eyes shut. "Do it," the boy sobbed. "Just do it fast." "Please," Silas stared at him. He didn't pull the trigger. "Open your eyes," Silas commanded. The boy opened them. He was trembling violently. "What's your name, kid?" "Tommy." "Tommy Miller." "Why are you out here, Tommy?" Silas asked. His voice was low, hard, but not cruel. "Why are you hunting a woman through the snow for Judd Thorne?" "My pa," the boy choked out. "He owes the mayor money. A lot of money. They said if I rode with them, they'd forgive the debt. They said they'd let us keep our farm. I didn't want to hurt nobody. I swear to God, I just wanted to save my family." Silas looked at the boy. He saw the desperate, crushing weight of poverty. He saw a system that forced good people to do wicked things just to survive. He saw himself 10 years ago. Silas slowly lowered the hammer on his Colt. He holstered the weapon. Tommy stared at him in disbelief. "Listen to me, Tommy," Silas said. He stepped closer. "A man's life isn't a number on a ledger. Your soul isn't collateral for a corrupt bank." Tommy swallowed hard. He nodded weakly. "Judd Thorne lied to you," Silas continued. "He won't forgive the debt. He'll use you until you're dead, and then he'll take your farm anyway. That is how his kind operates." Silas picked up the boy's rifle. He ejected the shells into the snow. He tossed the empty gun back to Tommy. "You have a choice right now," Silas said. "You can be their dog, or you can be a man. Walk away. Go home to your father. Tell him the debt is a lie. Tell him a storm is coming for the mayor. They'll kill me," Tommy whispered. "Only if you stay," Silas said. "Go now." Tommy looked at the empty rifle in his hands. He looked at Silas. Something shifted in the boy's terrified eyes. A tiny, flickering spark of dignity. "Thank you," Tommy breathed. He turned and ran. He didn't look back. He vanished into the falling snow. Silas listened. The woods were quiet. The remaining riders had heard the scuffle. They were retreating, dragging their wounded back toward the valley. They had lost their nerve. Silas walked back up the slope to the boulders. Ellie peeked out from behind the granite. She held a heavy rock in her hand. Ready to fight, she saw Silas. She dropped the rock. "Are you hurt?" she asked. She rushed over, checking him for blood. "No," Silas said. He looked down at her hands, checking his coat. "They're gone," I heard voices, Ellie said softly. "I heard you talking to someone." "Just a kid," Silas said. He looked back at the tree line. "Just a kid who got lost in the dark." Ellie studied his face. She understood. She didn't press him. She just nodded. "Mercy is a dangerous thing out here," Ellie said. "I know," Silas replied. He met her gaze. "But living without it is worse." The fire crackled in the darkness. They had ridden hard for 6 hours. They circled wide, doubling back toward the outskirts of Silver Creek. They made camp in a dry, narrow ravine hidden by thick brush. Across the fire sat Thaddeus, the bank manager. They had caught him 3 miles outside of town. He was riding a sweaty mare, his saddlebags bulging with cash and clothing. He was trying to flee before the storm broke. Now his hands were tied securely behind his back. He sat on a log, sweating despite the freezing night air. He was the missing link. The ledger had the numbers. The ledger had the victims. But Thaddeus had the bank's official seal. He was the inside man. If he testified, the ledger went from a dead man's diary to a federal indictment. Silas sat on a rock. He was carving a piece of pine with a hunting knife. His eyes flicked to Thaddeus every few seconds. Thaddeus flinched every time Silas moved. "I don't know anything," Thaddeus stammered for the 5th time. "I swear I just managed the vault." Silas stopped carving. He looked at Thaddeus. The look was entirely devoid of warmth. "You managed the vault while they burned women and children out of the valley today," Silas said quietly. Thaddeus went pale. He swallowed hard. "I wasn't there." "You signed the paper that put the match in their hands," Silas said. Drove the hunting knife into the log he was sitting on. The blade sank deep into the wood. Thaddeus jumped. Ellie stepped between them. She handed Silas a tin cup of hot coffee. She placed a hand on his shoulder. A gentle pressure. "Let me." Silas took the coffee. He leaned back. He watched her. Ellie walked over to Thaddeus. She knelt in the dirt in front of him. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten him. She looked at him with genuine, heartbreaking sorrow, "Mr. Thaddeus," Ellie said softly. "I remember when I was a little girl. My father brought me into your bank. You gave me a peppermint stick. You told my father he had the best soil in the county. You were a good man." Thaddeus looked at the ground. His shoulders slumped. "What happened to you?" Ellie asked. The question wasn't an accusation. It was a plea for understanding. They came to me," Thaddeus whispered. His voice cracked. 5 years ago. Mayor Thorne. He had men from the east with him. Men in fine suits. They said if I didn't cooperate, they'd ruin the bank. They'd take my home. They threatened my wife. "Ellie, what was I supposed to do?" "You were supposed to stand up," Ellie said. "You were supposed to say no." "I'm a coward," Thaddeus sobbed. He finally looked at her. His face was wet with tears. "I know I am. I watched them forge your father's deed. I watched them steal from the native families. I stamped the papers. I did it. Then undo it," Ellie said. She reached out and placed her bandaged hand over his trembling knee. A mistake doesn't have to be the end of your story, Ellie said. You can't bring back the people who died. You can't unburn those homes. But you can stop it from happening to anyone else. You can ride to the Capitol with us. You can testify before the federal judge. You can tell them everything. Thorne will kill me, Thaddeus whimpered. Thorne is already dead, Silas spoke up from the shadows. His voice was absolute. He just doesn't know it yet. You ride with us. You have my protection. You run, you have my bullet. Make a choice. Thaddeus looked at Silas. Then he looked at Ellie. He looked at the terrible, inspiring strength in her eyes. I'll testify, Thaddeus breathed. I'll give you everything. Ellie nodded. She stood up. She walked over to Silas and sat down beside him on the log. They drank their coffee in silence. Thaddeus eventually fell into an exhausted sleep against a tree trunk. The night deepened. The stars were brilliant shards of ice against the black sky. Silas watched the flames dance. He felt Ellie shivering next to him. He unclasped his heavy canvas coat and draped it over her shoulders. She pulled the thick fabric tight. It smelled like pine, gun oil, and him. You were good with him, Silas said quietly. Most people would have broken his jaw. You broke his guilt. That takes a stronger hand. Violence just makes cowards lie faster, Ellie said. She looked at him. My father taught me that. People want to be good, Silas. Sometimes they just need someone to remind them they still have a choice. Silas looked down at his hands. 3 days ago, Silas said. The words felt heavy on his tongue. In the square. When those men told me not to look, Ellie stayed quiet. She waited. I almost listened, Silas confessed. The shame of it tasted bitter. I almost turned my horse around. I had spent 6 years convincing myself that the world was ugly, and nothing I did could change it. I was going to ride away and let them take your land. Ellie shifted closer to him. The warmth of her leg pressed against his. You didn't, she said softly. Because you looked at me, Silas said. He turned his head. He looked into her dark, fiery eyes. You were bleeding. You were beaten. And you weren't asking for a savior. You were just daring me to be a man. Daring me to care. He reached out. He traced the line of her jaw with a calloused thumb. Ignoring that warning, Silas whispered, was the only thing that saved my soul. Ellie's breath hitched. She didn't look away. She leaned into his touch. You saved me, Silas, she murmured. No, he said. His voice was thick with emotion he had buried for years. We saved each other. Silas leaned in. He didn't rush. He gave her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. She closed the distance. Their lips met. It wasn't a desperate, frantic kiss. It was slow, deep. It was the careful collision of two people who had been broken, finally finding a peace that fit. The cold wind howled through the ravine, but Silas didn't feel it. For the first time in 6 years, the fire inside him was burning brighter than the dark. Dawn arrived painted in bruised shades of purple and gray. The fire was reduced to glowing embers. Silas was awake, feeding small twigs into the coals to boil a fresh pot of coffee. Ellie sat near the warmth. She had the heavy lockbox open on her lap. She was cross-referencing her father's ledger with the forged deeds they had taken from Thaddeus' saddlebags. Thaddeus sat across from them. His hands were unbound now. He was rubbing his wrists, looking miserable but resigned. Tell me about the men from the east, Ellie said without looking up from the papers. The men in the fine suits. Who are they? Thaddeus coughed. He accepted a tin cup of coffee from Silas with a trembling hand. They call themselves the Eastern Railroad Consortium, Thaddeus said. A group of investors out of Chicago and New York. They have endless money, endless reach. Ellie flipped a page in the ledger. Why do they want this specific valley so badly? The grade, Thaddeus explained. The engineers surveyed the mountains. The pass through Whispering Pines is the only flat, stable route for heavy freight trains through this entire mountain range. Whoever owns this valley controls the flow of silver and timber for the next 50 years. Silas frowned. The government grants right-of-ways for railroads. They don't need to burn people out. They do if they want absolute monopoly. Thaddeus corrected. If the locals own the land, the railroad has to pay them royalties. However, if the consortium owns the deeds outright, they keep everything. Billions of dollars over the next century. Ellie traced a line of ink on a forged deed. The English contracts, she murmured. Yes, Thaddeus said, looking down. That was the mayor's idea. The Mexican laborers and the native families. They couldn't read English legal jargon. The mayor had me draft protection contracts. They thought they were signing papers to keep their land safe from the government. In reality, they were signing over their property rights for pennies. Disgust washed over Silas. It was cold and familiar. It was the exact same tactic the barons had used to steal his farm in the valley years ago. Use the law as a weapon against the vulnerable. And my father found out, Ellie said. Her voice was remarkably steady. Daniel Vance was too smart. Thaddeus nodded. He started reading the contracts for the migrant families. He started explaining what the words meant. He was organizing a legal defense fund. He was going to petition the federal governor, so the mayor ordered him killed. Silas stated flatly. Yes, Thaddeus whispered. Ellie closed the ledger. The sound was loud in the quiet ravine. She took a deep breath. She didn't cry. She had moved past tears. She was forging her grief into iron. We have the motive, Ellie said. We have the forged deeds. We have the witness. We just need to tie Mayor Thorne directly to the consortium. Thaddeus reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded, wax-sealed letter. You don't need to tie him to it, Thaddeus said. He handed the letter across the fire to Ellie. He is it. Ellie broke the seal. She unfolded the heavy parchment. She read the elegant, looping script. Her brow furrowed in confusion. This is a letter of appointment, Ellie said, from the board of directors in Chicago. It grants full territorial authority over the land acquisitions. Read the name, Thaddeus said. Ellie scanned down to the bottom of the page. She read the name out loud. To our esteemed Western Director and Chief Acquisitions Officer, Cornelius Thorne. The name hung in the freezing air. Silas stopped moving. The tin coffee pot in his hand froze over the flames. Cornelius Thorne, Ellie repeated. She looked at Thaddeus. The mayor isn't just a hired thug. He's an executive for the consortium. He's one of the architects. He owns the whole operation. Thaddeus confirmed. The coffee pot slipped from Silas' grip. It hit the rocks. Boiling water hissed and spat over the coals, sending up a cloud of white steam. Ellie flinched at the sound. She looked at Silas. His face was completely drained of color. His gray eyes were wide, staring at the letter in her hands with a look of absolute, sickening horrors. Ellie asked. She set the letter down. Silas. What is it? Silas didn't answer. He stood up. He turned his back to the fire. He walked a few paces away, his hands gripping his hair. He was breathing hard, the rhythmic, controlled breaths of a man trying desperately not to fall apart. Ellie stood up. She walked over to him. She reached out to touch his arm. Silas flinched away from her hand like it was made of hot iron. Don't, he choked out. Ellie froze. Silas, what's wrong? You're scaring me. Silas slowly turned around. The look in his eyes broke her heart. It was the look of a man drowning in shame. Thorne, Silas whispered. What? My last name, Silas said. The words sounded like broken glass in his throat. My name is Silas Thorne. Ellie stared at him. The wind rustled the dead leaves in the ravine. The pieces slowly clicked together in her mind. The gold signet ring on Judd's hand. The way Silas had recognized it. Cornelius, Ellie breathed. He's my uncle, Silas finished. He closed his eyes. My father's brother. Judd is my blood cousin. The silence between them was devastating. Silas took a step back. He created distance between them. Physical distance. Emotional distance. I left 10 years ago, Silas said. His voice was ragged. When I realized how Cornelius made his money, when I saw him foreclosing on widows and bribing judges, I changed my name. I walked away. I thought if I didn't look at it, it wouldn't be my sin to carry. He opened his eyes. He looked at the lockbox. He looked at the forged deeds. The blood in my veins, Silas said, his voice trembling with self-loathing, is the same blood that ordered your father's murder. It's the same blood that burned those families in the snow yesterday. I am a thorn. I am the thing you're fighting. He expected her to scream. He expected her to draw his own gun and point it at his chest. He deserved it. Ellie didn't scream. She didn't step back. She stepped forward. She closed the distance he had tried to create. She reached out with both hands. She grabbed the lapels of his heavy coat. She held him tight, anchoring him to the earth. "Look at me," Ellie commanded. Silas kept his eyes on the ground. "Eleanor, don't look at me." "Silas Thorne." He slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. He expected disgust. He found only a fierce, unwavering light. "A man is not defined by the blood in his veins," Ellie said. Her voice was strong. It rang with absolute conviction. "A man is not defined by the sins of his father, or his uncle, or his brother." She let go of his coat. She brought her hands up to his face. She cradled his jaw, her thumbs brushing against his beard. "You are defined by the choices you make when the gun is in your hand," Ellie said. "My father was killed by a thorn, but my life was saved by a thorn. A thorn bandaged my bleeding hands. A thorn showed mercy to a terrified boy in the woods. A thorn kissed me by the fire and made me feel safe for the first time in my life." Silas felt a tear break loose. It slid down his cheek. He didn't bother wiping it away. "I carry their name," Silas whispered. "Then we will take the name back," Ellie said fiercely. "We will drag Cornelius into the light. We will show the world the difference between a tyrant and a good man. You are not your uncle, Silas. You are the man standing in front of me." She pulled him down. She rested her forehead against his. "We finish this," Ellie said. Together, Silas closed his eyes. The crushing weight of his past didn't disappear. But for the first time in his life, he didn't have to carry it alone. He wrapped his arms around her waist. He held her tight against the cold morning wind. Together, Silas promised. The road to the capital cut through Red Canyon. It was a vicious scar in the earth. High walls of rusted sandstone rose on either side. The trail narrowed to a bottleneck of loose rock and dry brush. Silas hated it. Any man with a badge and a brain hated a canyon. It was a natural coffin. But it was the only way through the mountains. Before the next blizzard hit, they rode in a tight line. Silas took the lead. His Winchester rested across his saddle horn. His eyes scanned the ridges. Ellie rode closely behind him. She held the reins with one hand. Her other hand rested on the heavy lockbox tied to her saddle. Thaddeus brought up the rear. He was sweating despite the bitter cold. The silence in the canyon was heavy, unnatural, no birds, no wind. Just the rhythmic crunch of horse hooves on gravel. "Keep moving," Silas said softly. "Don't stop for anything." They were halfway through the gorge when the trap sprang. A sharp crack echoed off the canyon walls. It wasn't thunder, it was a high-caliber rifle. The dirt exploded 2 feet from Silas' horse. The roan screamed and reared. "Get down," Silas yelled. He didn't wait to dismount. He threw himself from the saddle. He hit the dirt hard, dragging Ellie down with him. They scrambled behind an outcrop of jagged sandstone. Thaddeus shrieked and fell from his mare. He crawled on his belly to join them. Gunfire rained down from the high ridges. The canyon echoed with the deafening roar of repeating rifles. Dust and stone chips flew into the air. Silas peeked around the rock. He counted the muzzle flashes. 4 on the left ridge, 3 on the right. These weren't Mayor Thorne's local thugs. These men shot with terrifying precision. They were Pinkertons, hired guns sent from the east by the railroad consortium. Professionals. "They were waiting for us," Silas muttered. He wiped the dirt from his eyes. He checked the chamber of his Winchester. "Can you hit them?" Ellie asked. She kept her head down. She didn't panic. She just assessed the reality. "They have the high ground," Silas said grimly, "and the sun is at their backs. We are pinned." A bullet ricocheted off the rock inches from Ellie's face. She flinched, pulling her coat tight. Thaddeus was sobbing quietly, his hands covering the back of his head. "We give them the ledger," Thaddeus cried. "Throw the box out. They just want the papers." "They want no witnesses," Silas corrected him. His voice was cold. "You walk out there. You die." Silas raised his rifle. He took a breath. He leaned out and fired 3 rapid shots at the left ridge. A man up top shouted, scrambling back from the ledge. But the return fire was immediate and overwhelming. Silas ducked back. His shoulder slammed against the rock. He checked his ammunition belt. He had 20 rounds left for the rifle, 12 for his Colt. It wasn't enough, not against 7 men with unlimited ammunition and absolute elevation. He looked at Ellie. She was watching him. She knew the math. "I'm going to draw their fire," Silas said. His voice was completely steady. "I'll make a run for the boulders across the trail. When they turn their guns on me, you take the horses and run back the way we came. Don't look back, just ride. Ellie reached out. She grabbed his arm. Her grip was iron. No, she said. Eleanor, there is no other way out of this. I am not leaving you, she said fiercely. She reached into his holster. She pulled out his heavy Colt .45. She held it awkwardly but firmly. We fight together, or we die together. But you are not sacrificing yourself for me. Silas stared at her. He saw the absolute resolve in her eyes. It was the same look she had in the town square. She wouldn't look away. She wouldn't run. A heavy silence fell over the canyon. The shooting stopped. They're reloading, Silas said, or they're moving into position to flank us. Let them come, Ellie whispered. Then a strange sound cut through the canyon. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a low rumbling hiss. It sounded like a massive snake waking up in the rocks. Silas looked up at the right ridge. A small tendril of white smoke was snaking its way along the edge of the cliff. Get down, Silas roared. He threw his body over Ellie, pressing her flat against the dirt. The explosion shook the earth. A deafening boom echoed through the gorge. The top of the right ridge blew outward in a massive cloud of fire and pulverized stone. A shower of gravel and boulders cascaded down the canyon wall, burying the trail 50 yards ahead of them. Screams drifted down from the ridge. The hired guns were scrambling. Silas looked up through the settling dust. Figures were appearing on the canyon rim. Not 7 men, dozens of them. They stepped up to the edge of the cliff. They carried hunting rifles, pickaxes, shovels. They were covered in soot and mud. In the center of the crowd stood a young boy. He held a smoking stick of dynamite in one hand and a repeater rifle in the other. Tommy Miller. Beside him stood old Gideon, a crude bandage wrapped around his head. Surrounding them were the Mexican laborers who had been burned out of their homes, the native families who had been driven from their land, the poor farmers who owed their souls to Thornspank. They had taken the high ground. Tommy raised his rifle. He aimed it down at the surviving Pinkerton men, who were frantically trying to find cover. Throw down your guns, Tommy's voice cracked, but it echoed loudly in the canyon. Throw them down, or we bury you under the rest of this mountain. The hired guns looked up. They looked at the sheer numbers facing them. They were professionals. They fought for pay, not for pride. They looked at the angry, desperate faces of a community that had nothing left to lose. One by one, the rifles clattered to the rocks. The Pinkertons raised their hands. Silas slowly pushed himself off the dirt. He helped Ellie to her feet. They stood in the dust of the canyon. They looked up at the ridge. Tommy Miller looked down at Silas. The boy gave a sharp, respectful nod. Silas nodded back. He felt a profound, unfamiliar tightness in his chest. How did they know? Silas asked softly. Ellie smiled. Her face was covered in dirt, but her eyes were radiant. Before we left the ruined settlement, I gave Gideon's grandson a message. I told him to ride to the mining camps, to the farms. I told him to tell the people that Daniel Vance's daughter was taking the fight to the capital, and if they wanted their land back, they needed to stand up. Silas stared at her. He was humbled by her brilliance. You organized an army, he said. No, Ellie replied. She looked up at the working people standing shoulder to shoulder on the ridge. I just reminded them that they weren't alone. You taught me that, Silas. Mercy isn't a weakness. Kindness isn't a vulnerability. It's the only way we survive. The laborers scrambled down the canyon walls. They secured the hired guns. They cleared the rocks from the trail. Old Gideon walked up to Ellie. He took his hat off. We are coming with you. Ellie, Gideon said, to the capital, to the judge. We are done hiding. Silas looked at the crowd. He saw the strength of a united people. He saw the exact opposite of the apathy that had poisoned Silver Creek. He loaded his Winchester. He slipped it into the scabbard. Mount up, Silas said. His voice was steady and proud. We have a judge to find. They didn't just find a judge. They brought the law back with them. Silver Creek was quiet when they rode in. It was a tense, suffocating quiet, the kind of silence that precedes a massive storm. People peeked through the slats of their window blinds. Shopkeepers locked their doors. But they couldn't ignore the procession. Silas and Ellie rode at the front. Beside them rode Federal Judge Harrison, a stern, gray-bearded man sent from the capital. Behind them marched a dozen heavily armed federal marshals. And behind the marshals walked the people, over 50 men and women, miners, farmers, Native Americans. They walked with their heads held high. They had come to reclaim their town. They stopped in the center of the town square, the exact spot where Silas had first seen Ellie bleeding in the dust. Mayor Cornelius Thorne stood on the elevated porch of the town hall. He was dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit. He smoked a cigar. He looked down at the crowd with practiced, arrogant boredom. Judd stood right behind him, his hand resting nervously on his gun belt. "Judge Harrison," Cornelius called out. His voice was smooth. "What is the meaning of this spectacle? Are we having a parade?" Judge Harrison spurred his horse forward. He pulled a thick sheaf of papers from his saddlebag. "Cornelius Thorne," the judge said loudly. His voice carried across the entire square. "I hold in my hand a federal warrant for your arrest. I also have an injunction freezing every asset, deed, and bank account tied to the Eastern Railroad Consortium in this territory." Cornelius took a slow puff of his cigar. He didn't flinch. "On what grounds?" Cornelius asked. "I am a legitimate businessman. I am the mayor of this town." Ellie rode forward. She stopped her horse right beside the judge. She held up her father's heavy leather ledger. "On the grounds of extortion," Ellie said clearly. "Fraud, arson, and murder." Cornelius finally looked at her. His eyes narrowed. He looked at the lockbox. Then he looked at Thaddeus, who was sitting on a horse surrounded by marshals. The mayor's arrogant facade cracked, just a fraction. But it was enough. "You have no proof of anything." Cornelius sneered. "Just the scribblings of a dead man and the lies of an incompetent bank clerk. We have the original deeds," Judge Harrison countered. "We have sworn testimony. We have a confession from your hired guns at Red Canyon. The game is over. Thorne, step down. Surrender your weapons." Cornelius stared at the judge. He looked at the 50 angry townsfolk, blocking his escape routes. He looked at the federal marshals, leveling their rifles at him. He realized in that moment that his money couldn't buy his way out of this square. Cornelius slowly raised his hands. He let his cigar fall from his lips. "Very well," Cornelius said smoothly. He was already planning his legal defense. "I will cooperate. We will sort this misunderstanding out in court." "No," the scream came from Judd. He didn't raise his hands. He snapped. The realization that his inherited empire was crumbling in front of him broke his mind. Judd drew his pistol. The square erupted into chaos. Judd didn't aim at the marshals. He lunged off the porch. He grabbed the closest target. He grabbed Ellie. He yanked her violently from her saddle. She hit the ground hard. Before anyone could react, Judd hauled her to her feet. He spun her around, pressing her back against his chest. He jammed the barrel of his revolver hard against her temple. "Nobody move," Judd screamed. His eyes were wild. Spittle flew from his lips. "Drop your guns, all of you. Drop them, or I blow her brains out." The federal marshals froze. They slowly lowered their rifles. Judge Harrison raised his hands. The crowd gasped and backed away. Silas sat on his horse. He was 10 feet away. He hadn't moved. He hadn't drawn his weapon. He just stared at his cousin. "Back off," Judd yelled at Silas. He tightened his grip on Elia's throat. She choked, but her eyes remained fiercely locked on Silas. "Drop the gun belt, cousin. I know who you are. My father told me. You re a disgrace to the family name. Drop the belt and turn around." Silas looked at Ellie. He saw the bruise forming on her jaw. He felt the cold, familiar ghost of his past tapping him on the shoulder. This was the moment. The universe was forcing him to repeat his tragedy. "Turn away," Judd screamed, his finger twitching on the trigger. "Drop the gun and turn away. Thorne, don't look." Silas took a slow, deep breath. He didn't look away. "I'm done looking away," Silas said softly. He moved. It wasn't a fast, frantic draw. It was the smooth, practiced motion of a man who had spent his life surviving violence. His hand blurred. The Colt at 45 cleared the leather. He didn't aim with his eyes. He aimed with his instincts. He aimed with the absolute certainty of a man defending his home. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening. Judd's head snapped back. His grip on Ellie vanished instantly. The revolver slipped from his lifeless fingers. He collapsed into the dirt, dead before he hit the ground. Ellie stumbled forward. Silas was out of his saddle before she fell. He caught her in his arms. He held her tight. He buried his face in her hair. "I got you," Silas whispered. "I got you." The square was utterly silent. No one breathed. Cornelius Thorne stared at the body of his son. The ruthless mayor finally looked like a broken old man. Two federal marshals stepped up and slapped iron cuffs onto his wrists. Ellie pulled back from Silas's embrace. She was trembling, but she forced herself to stand tall. She brushed the dirt from her skirt. She turned to face the town. The people of Silver Creek were watching her. The shopkeepers who had hidden, the cowards who had looked away, the brave laborers who had fought. Ellie walked to the steps of the town hall. She stood where the mayor had stood, but she didn't look down at the people. She looked them in the eye. "Look at this," Ellie commanded. Her voice was raw, but it carried to the edges of the square. She pointed at the locked doors of the businesses. She pointed at the corrupted bank. "For years, you let this happen," she said. "You saw families driven from their homes. You saw men cheated. You saw my father murdered, and you closed your blinds. You thought that if you kept your heads down, the fire wouldn't reach your door." She looked at the wealthy merchants in the front row. "Apathy doesn't protect you," Ellie said fiercely. "It just feeds the wolves. Land can be measured in acres. It can be bought with dollars. But human dignity cannot be bought. It cannot be forged on a piece of paper." She stepped down toward the crowd. "The law was not created to be a shield for the rich," Ellie declared. Her words were a hammer striking an anvil. "It is meant to be a sword to protect the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to equality for every single person standing on this dirt, whether you are a rancher, a Mexican miner, or a native mother. We all bleed the same. We all deserve the same justice." She looked back at Silas. He was watching her with absolute awe. "My father died believing this town could be better," Ellie said. "Today, we proved him right. Don't ever look away again. Because when we stand together, no tyrant can break us." The silence held for a long moment. Then old Gideon stepped forward. He began to clap. Tommy Miller joined in. Then the miners, then the farmers. Finally, the shopkeepers pushed their doors open and stepped out into the light. The applause washed over the square like a cleansing rain. The storm was finally over. 3 months later. The air in Silver Creek tasted different. The oppressive, suffocating dust had settled. A cool spring breeze blew down from the whispering pines, carrying the scent of fresh pine needles and blooming wildflowers. The town was healing. It wasn't perfect. Healing takes time, but the fear was gone. Cornelius Thorne was sitting in a federal penitentiary in the east. He was awaiting a trial that would likely put him behind bars for the rest of his natural life. The Eastern Railroad Consortium had faced massive federal indictments. Their executives were scrambling to avoid prison. The railroad would still come through the valley, but it would come on the town's terms. Judge Harrison had spent 2 months sorting through Daniel Vance's ledger. Every stolen acre was returned. The forged deeds were burned in a bonfire in the town square. The Mexican laborers and native families were granted official, federally protected titles to the land they had worked for generations. They were currently rebuilding their settlement with lumber paid for by the seized assets of Thorne's corrupt bank. Ellie spent her days riding between the settlement and the town. She helped organize the rebuilding. She sat in on the town council meetings. She made sure that the voices of the working class were never silenced again. She was her father's daughter. She had become the conscience of Silver Creek. But right now, she wasn't worrying about the town. She was walking up the dirt path toward her own ranch house. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the green pastures. She heard the rhythmic thud of a hammer striking wood. She smiled. Silas was by the horse corral. He didn't wear a gun belt anymore. He wore faded denim trousers and a white cotton shirt rolled up to his elbows. He was sweating in the late afternoon sun, driving a heavy iron nail into a new cedar fence post he hadn't ridden away. When the dust settled in the square 3 months ago, Ellie had braced herself. She expected the drifter to drift. She expected the man who had lost everything to fear building something new. But Silas had handed his guns to a federal marshal. He had walked up to her ranch. He picked up a hammer, and he started fixing the broken things. He was healing the land. and in doing so, he was healing himself. He had stopped running from his name. He was Silas Thorne, but the people in town didn't spit when they said it anymore. They tipped their hats to him. He was the Thorne who had stood up to the wolves. Ellie leaned against the wooden gate. She watched the muscles in his back flex as he drove the nail home. "You're going to put the local carpenter out of business," Ellie said. Silas stopped hammering. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. He turned and smiled at her. It was a real smile. It reached his gray eyes, warming them from the inside out. "Fence was leaning," Silas said simply. "A leaning fence invites trouble. We've had enough trouble to last a lifetime," Ellie said. She walked over to him. She didn't hesitate. She stepped into his space and wrapped her arms around his waist. She pressed her cheek against his chest. She could hear his heart beating. Strong, steady. Safe, Silas dropped the hammer. He wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin on the top of her head. He smelled like sawdust, sweat, and sunshine. They stood there in the quiet evening. The horses whinnied softly in the corral. "I went up to the mountain today," Silas said quietly. Ellie looked up at him. "To the cabin?" "Yeah," Silas nodded. "I packed up the rest of my things, brought them down here, locked the door. I don't think I'll be going back up there." Ellie's heart swelled. "You don't need a hiding place anymore." "No," Silas agreed. He reached up and gently tucked a stray strand of dark hair behind her ear. His rough fingers lingered on her cheek. "A man only hides when he has nothing left to protect. I have plenty to protect right here." He looked out over the ranch. He looked at the rolling green hills. He looked at the smoke rising from the chimneys in the distant settlement. He had spent 10 years believing that the world was entirely cruel. He had believed that the strong would always crush the weak, and the law was just a tool for thieves. But Ellie had proved him wrong. She had shown him that justice wasn't a piece of paper. Justice was a community standing shoulder to shoulder. Justice was the courage to look at the broken pieces of the world and decide to fix them. "I was thinking," Silas murmured. "That's dangerous," Ellie teased gently. "I was thinking about the day I rode into that square," Silas said. His voice turned serious. "Reverend, I was thinking about the men who had you on the ground." Ellie rested her hands on his chest. "I try not to think about them. I think about what they said," Silas continued. He looked deeply into her eyes. "They told me to turn away. 3 men warned me. They told me not to look." He leaned down. He kissed her. It was a kiss full of profound gratitude. It was a promise for all the tomorrows they had fought so hard to earn. Silas pulled back just far enough to look at her face in the fading golden light. "Thank God I didn't listen to them," Silas whispered. "Because when I looked at you, Eleanor, I finally saw my home." Ellie smiled, tears of absolute joy shining in her eyes. She pulled him down for another kiss as the sun finally dipped below the whispering pines, leaving the valley bathed in the warm, enduring light of a new beginning. The narrative presented here is fictional and created for artistic expression. Names, characters, and incidents are either invented or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is unintended and should not be considered factual or deliberate. As the sun settles beyond the whispering pines and the last golden light falls across the fields of Silver Creek, the story of Silas and Eleanor leaves us with a truth that reaches far beyond the frontier. Evil does not grow powerful only because cruel men possess money, weapons, or influence. It grows powerful because ordinary people become afraid to look, afraid to speak, and afraid to stand beside those who are suffering. Silas believed that keeping his head down was the safest way to survive. After losing his wife, his land, and his faith in the law, he convinced himself that the pain of the world was no longer his responsibility. But the moment he saw Eleanor lying in the dirt, bleeding yet unbroken, he was forced to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. He could ride away and protect his quiet life, or he could step forward and protect someone who had no one else. That choice changed everything. It reminds us that courage does not always begin with confidence. Sometimes courage begins when a frightened person takes one small step toward what is right, even while every voice inside them is begging them to turn away. Silas was not fearless. Eleanor was not invincible. Tommy was not a born hero. Thaddeus was not naturally brave. Each of them carried fear, guilt, grief, and weakness. What made them different was that they eventually chose not to let those weaknesses control the ending of their stories. Eleanor teaches us that dignity cannot be stolen by violence, poverty, or humiliation. The men who dragged her through the square could tear her clothes, bruise her body, and threaten her life, but they could not force her to surrender the truth. Her strength did not come from a gun. It came from knowing that her father's work mattered, and that the vulnerable families around her deserved justice. She refused to fight only for her own ranch. She fought for the miners, the farmers, the native families, the widows, and every person whose voice had been buried beneath contracts they could not understand. Her courage shows us that the greatest victories are rarely won by people seeking only to save themselves. They are won by those willing to make their struggle large enough to include others. Silas also teaches us that our past may explain us, but it does not have to define us. He carried the Thorn name like a curse, because the same blood ran through the men who had destroyed so many lives. Yet Eleanor reminded him that character is not inherited. A family name cannot decide whether a man becomes a tyrant or a protector. That decision is made through daily choices, whether he uses his strength to dominate or defend, whether he answers cruelty with more cruelty or leaves room for mercy, and whether he hides from the sins around him or brings them into the light. Silas could not change the family into which he was born, but he could change what that name meant when it was spoken. Many people carry shame that does not truly belong to them, the failures of parents, the mistakes of families, or wounds passed down through generations. This story reminds us that we are not prisoners of inherited darkness. We can become the first person to break the pattern. We can take a name connected to pain and attach it to courage, compassion, and honor. The mercy Silas showed Tommy is another important lesson. It would have been easy to pull the trigger and call it justice. But Silas looked beyond the rifle in the boy's hands and saw the desperation behind it. He understood that corrupt systems often turn the poor against one another, forcing frightened people to become weapons for powerful men. By sparing Tommy, Silas did more than save one young life. He awakened the boy's conscience, and that act of mercy later saved Silas and Eleanor in Red Canyon. Kindness is not always rewarded so clearly or so quickly, but it is never meaningless. A merciful choice can travel farther than we will ever see. It can give someone the courage to become better than the worst thing they have done. The people of Silver Creek also learned that silence is not neutrality. Closing the blinds did not keep corruption away. It only